She whispered under her breath to her friend, "All right, do it." The friend got out of the car dressed in jeans, a khaki coat, red gloves, and heavy makeup that she covered up with a domino mask. She walked directly to the house and stood there for a few seconds before ringing the doorbell. It was Halloween night 1957 in Sun Valley, Los Angeles, California. Hairstylist Peter Fabiano had already gone to bed with his wife Betty when he heard the doorbell ring at around 11 p.m. He thought to himself, it's a bit late for trick-or-treaters, but he got up, stumbled downstairs, and grabbed the bowl of remaining candy on his way to answer the door. He looked at the mysterious person and asked, "It's a bit late for this, isn't it?" "No," was the last word that Peter Fabiano ever heard as the figure in front of him lifted a brown paper bag and shot him. The shooter didn't wait to see if Peter was dead or if anyone had seen her. She ran back to the car where her friend was waiting. As she got in, her friend leaned over and kissed her, saying, "Thank you." Meanwhile, inside the house, just a few seconds beforehand, Betty had heard a deep voice and a loud pop that woke up her daughter, Judy. Betty ran to the front door only to find her husband, Peter, bleeding out in a pool of his own blood. Judy ran to her police officer neighbor's home, who called in the Valley Police Department. Peter was quickly taken to the Sun Valley Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at the scene from a gunshot to his chest. The only witness to the horrible crime was a teenager who saw a car speeding away from the neighborhood. There were no gunshots left at the scene, and nothing had been taken from the house. Peter's shooting had the characteristics of a gang hit, but the only record the hairstylist had was for a charge of bookmaking in 1948. He had no connection to any criminal group, so that lead was quickly kiboshed. It took a few days for Betty to come around and compose herself before she was able to speak to police. She told them that she heard two voices coming from downstairs, a man and someone that sounded like a man pretending to be a woman. Peter and Betty had met in the 1940s. She was a divorcee and a single mother of two. He was a truck driver. The pair got married and began their lives together in New York, but had moved to Los Angeles just the previous year in 1956, where they had set up two beauty shops. When asked if Peter had any enemies, Betty gave police the only name that she could think of, Joan Rabel. But for now, that name would take police nowhere, as Joan claimed to have no knowledge whatsoever of what had happened to Peter Fabiano. And it wasn't until an anonymous tip came into police that led them to a gun that had been stashed in a locker at a department store that the pieces of what had actually happened to Peter began to come together. A ballistics test confirmed a match to the gun found to the bullet fired into Peter Fabiano. The police soon learned that this gun belonged to Goldine Pizer. Joan Rabel was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1917, and she had had somewhat of a lucrative career as a writer and a photographer who sailed around the Americas. In 1957, she arrived at Peter Fabiano's salon looking for work after her divorce. She was hired on as a receptionist. Joan and Betty would become close friends, and when Peter and Betty began to start having marital problems, Betty moved in with Joan for a while. The Los Angeles Times described the women's relationship as abnormal, which in the 1950s was code for homosexual. The relationship between Betty and Joan threatened Peter, and he decided that he wanted his wife back and he wanted to work their marriage out. Eventually, Betty would agree and decide that her marriage to Peter was worth saving. She told Peter about the affair with Joan and agreed, once they reconciled, that she would not see Joan ever again. Soon after Betty went back to Peter, Joan realized that her girlfriend was serious about fixing her marriage. And to make matters even worse, Joan had also lost her job as Peter's receptionist, obviously. It wasn't long, though, before Joan met a woman named Goldine Pizer. They two became very close friends, and some suggest they were in a relationship as well. Goldine was a medical secretary and recent divorcee. It is reported that Goldine was also gay and that she had spent her life suppressing her feelings and had married Herbert Krome, a naval pharmacist. Joan began to seduce Goldine. They spent their free time together drinking coffee and gossiping, and it was during these coffee dates that Joan spoke about evil Peter Fabiano, her employer. She was heartbroken and angry that Betty went back to her husband, and she wanted revenge on Peter. And before long, Joan was telling Goldine that Peter Fabiano had to die, and somehow she convinced Goldine to kill a man that she had never even met. Goldine bought a .38 Smith & Wesson from a shop in Pasadena under the guise of wanting the weapon for personal protection. She then waited outside the Fabianos' home on Halloween night with Joan in a car that Joan had borrowed from a friend. They waited until all the lights in the house went out, then Goldine approached the home in a superhero eye mask and committed the murder. The two women left and quickly burned the clothes that they were wearing in case they contained any trace evidence. Afterwards, they returned the getaway car to the friend that they had borrowed it from earlier that day, and when the two women had completed their mission, Joan said to Goldine, "Forget you ever knew me," and they went their separate ways. The next day, Goldine realized that she still had the gun, so she rented a locker at a downtown LA department store named Bullock's and kept it there where she thought it would be safe. I'd really like to know who made the anonymous tip, but I couldn't find that information, so we are left to wonder who could have known about the gun. Maybe Goldine told someone, I don't know. At any rate, this tip solved the case. On November the 12th, Goldine was arrested in connection to Peter Fabiano's death. In the interrogation room, she confessed to everything, telling police that it was all Joan's idea. Joan had coerced her into killing Peter. She didn't even know the man. She said she bought the gun with money that Joan had given her, and she said that they had been planning the murder for weeks. The two of them had previously drove by the Fabiano home, and Joan had pointed Peter out to Goldine so that she would recognize him when the time came. Next, police interrogated Joan, but she insisted that she knew nothing about the crime. Nevertheless, both women were arrested for the murder of Peter Fabiano. Goldine allegedly said, quote, "It's a relief to get it off my mind." Before their trial started in December, both women had to meet with 3 psychiatrists. The courts seemed to believe that due to their homosexuality, they could be unfit to stand trial. Goldine was very open with the psychiatrist as she had been with the police. She was quoted as saying, "I had no motive, personally. Whatever motive I had was to please Joan. I was always easily influenced. I have been impressionable and always trusting." Joan, on the other hand, never spoke a word and denied to testify in court. One of the psychiatrists wrote about Goldine, quote, "The only thought she had was that she saved her friend, Joan Rabel, from an evil person." Both women pled not guilty. Goldine pled not guilty by saying that she was insane, claiming that she was just easily influenced. Joan, meanwhile, refused to comment throughout the hearing and was reported to have been sitting there stony-faced, and she wore an odd, creepy, constant smile throughout the whole trial. Goldine got on the stand and told the events of what happened that night, and as she did this, Joan allegedly could be seen just smiling. Both women were charged with first-degree murder, but through a plea deal, their charges were reduced to second-degree murder, and consequently, each woman was sentenced to 5 years to life in prison, even though they both were released relatively quickly, I think. Information on that is sparse, but they both were released. According to the LA Times, Goldine was released and remained in the Los Angeles area, and she died at the age of 83 in 1998. Joan was presumably released at some point, though there is little trace of her after 1957. Betty Fabiano went on to live a full life, and as far as we know, she passed away at the age of 81 in 1999. Reportedly, she had sold the beauty businesses, and even though she appeared to be the grieving wife, there are some out there who wonder if she did have a hand in her husband's death. On Halloween night 2011, 18-year-old Taylor Van Dyst left her home in Armstrong, British Columbia, Canada, dressed as a zombie for Halloween. She was meeting up with her friends and her boyfriend for one last night of trick-or-treating. Though she was 18 and felt a little old for the fun, she loved Halloween and just wanted to have a little bit more fun. Taylor left her house and walked alongside the railroad track in the small farming town around 6 p.m. that night. The trail she was walking, though it was secluded and dark, it was a well-traveled trail for local teens. Alone in the dark, Taylor sent her boyfriend, Colton, a text saying that she was, quote, being creeped. Nobody heard from Taylor again after this message, and after a little while, her friends decided to drive around looking for her, but they couldn't find her. Then at 7:30 p.m., her mom was alerted by some local boys that they had found her phone while playing near the railroad tracks. Her sister Kirsty called Taylor's friends and boyfriend, and they all went to the area to search for her. At 8:45 p.m., the group found Taylor face down in a ditch near the railroad tracks. She was alive, but she was unconscious. She was rushed to a hospital in Kelowna, but unfortunately she succumbed to her injuries a few hours later. Taylor had been beaten and strangled so badly that at first doctors thought she had been hit by a train. But Taylor didn't go down without a fight. She was kick-ass and scratched and fought her attacker, getting his DNA under her fingernails. And it was this DNA under her nails that would eventually convict the monster that was responsible for her horrific death. Tragically, though, it came out that night residents of Armstrong had heard Taylor screaming for her life. But since it was Halloween, they thought it was just Halloween festivities and nobody rushed to help save her. And then the residents of Armstrong were left reeling. I mean, it's not every day that something like this happens in small-town Canada. And at the time, the RCMP reported that more than 30 officers were working to solve the killing, and the case actually did receive quite a bit of media coverage. Like I said, 18-year-old Taylor lived in Armstrong, which was a relatively small town with just under 5,000 residents. She lived with her mom, Marie, and her twin sister, Kirsty. She had recently graduated high school at Pleasant Valley Secondary School, where she was said to have been involved with the jazz band, blues, and the junior and senior bands. She was a bright young woman who was loved by many in the close-knit community. Like I said, Taylor was kick-ass, and she fought her attacker and had numerous defensive wounds, including broken fingers and scratches on her own neck where she tried to pry his hands off of her. The DNA under Taylor's nails was matched to the DNA of an unknown attacker in another case. This one is where an escort was raped at knife point in 2005, and that case had never been solved. But even though police did have his DNA, it didn't match anybody in any database. So, police decided to create a sketch based on the description from the 2005 victim. I'm not sure why they didn't just do this in 2005. Who knows, maybe the attacker wouldn't have had the opportunity to hurt Taylor. But anyway, the person in the police sketch was recognized by residents of the town of Cherryville, BC, as 25-year-old Matthew Forster. But police couldn't track him down. He had fled BC, with help from his father. 60-year-old Stephen Forster had lied for his son, and that's not all he did. He helped his son evade capture by, it came out, in the 3 months after the murder, he left his job, he paid money for a driver's license, a social insurance number, and a bank card for his son, and lied to police telling them that his son was away working on oil rigs, when in fact, he was hiding out in Ontario. The father and son communicated on disposable cell phones to avoid being recorded or traced. In late March and early April 2012, the police were recording their communications and heard Stephen tell his son Matthew not to call home as police surveillance was in place and he needed to lay low. On April 4th, 2012, police finally found and arrested Matthew Forster in Ontario, where he was living under his new identity and working at a factory. Matthew Forster confessed to killing Taylor. He said on that Halloween night he was drinking and smoking weed when he drove to Armstrong for the sole purpose of finding a woman. He claims he was looking for consensual sex. He said he beat Taylor with a metal flashlight and strangled her with a shoelace and then disposed of the murder weapons on his drive home. A steel pipe that was found next to Taylor was also used and resulted in her skull being fractured. Her DNA was also found in his truck. Matthew Forster was charged with first-degree murder, and at the trial, the forensic pathologist testified that Taylor was choked and she was hit hard on the head 6 times, and that it was one of these blows that was hard enough to fracture her skull. He said that the 18-year-old had marks on her neck indicating that she was indeed strangled with something long and thin, like a piece of string or a necklace or a cord, and she also had a broken finger and bruising on her hands. Defensive injuries, he testified, from trying to fend off an attack. He said it was blunt force trauma from the blows to her head that caused the injuries that she died from a few hours later. Forster was convicted of first-degree murder but appealed the decision, and he actually was granted a new trial. He maintained that he was guilty of manslaughter, not murder, because he was trying to have consensual sex with Taylor. He was convicted of only second-degree murder, which means that he will be eligible for parole in 2029. Matthew's father, Stephen, received only a 3-year sentence and a $100 fine for helping his son evade police and using a false identity. Of Forster's sentencing, Marie Van Dyst, Taylor's mother, said, quote, "That is not very long for taking a life. As brutal as he took Taylor's life, I don't think he feels remorse." She also made a point of pointing out that in his letter of apology, he never once mentioned Taylor by name. It has also been revealed after this that Forster had committed at least one other attack, an attack on a 19-year-old neighbor back in Cherryville, where allegedly he had broke into her home while she slept. For all of his crimes, he was charged with first-degree murder, assault causing bodily harm, and sexual assault for all 3 attacks. But like I said, he appealed the first-degree murder conviction and was convicted of second-degree murder. In 2013, Taylor's mother and twin sister made the trail where Taylor last walked a memorial, called the Taylor Jade Van Dyst Memorial Trail. It is now paved and surrounded by flowers and landscaping the community added in her memory. There's even a bench and an angel statue dedicated to Taylor. So even though this is a solved case and Taylor's family can have some closure, I guess, it is really hard not to wonder if the sentencing in this case wasn't harsh enough for such a brutal crime. Thank you so much for your support. Until the next time, please stay safe out there.